Have you ever been judged by your uniform rather than your character? Have you ever wondered what happens when someone's prejudice collides with unexpected power? Have you ever seen discrimination backfire so spectacularly that it changes everything? This is the story of how a young nurse's humiliating rejection at an upscale restaurant led to the arrival of two gleaming Bentleys and a lesson in respect that an entire city would never forget. The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Riverside Memorial Hospital as the evening shift began its familiar rhythm. In the cardiac intensive care unit, 24-year-old Isabella Martinez moved through the corridors with the quiet efficiency that had become her trademark over the past 3 years. Her navy blue scrubs, pressed despite the long hours, bore the small stains and wrinkles that marked a day spent in service to others. The fluorescent lighting caught the exhaustion in her dark eyes, yet there remained a spark of determination that no amount of fatigue could extinguish. Isabella had always been drawn to healing. As a child growing up in the modest neighborhoods of East Portland, she had bandaged her younger siblings' scraped knees and comforted neighbors during illness. Her parents, both hard-working immigrants who cleaned office buildings downtown, had sacrificed everything to ensure their daughter could pursue her dream of becoming a nurse. The acceptance letter to nursing school had been framed and hung in their small kitchen, a beacon of hope that their sacrifices would create a better future. Tonight, like every night for the past 18 months, Isabella carried in her pocket a worn photograph of her father in his janitor's uniform, taken just weeks before the heart attack that claimed his life. She had been in her final semester of nursing school when the call came. The medical bills had consumed their modest savings, and Isabella had watched her mother age 10 years in the span of 6 months, working double shifts to keep their family afloat. The irony wasn't lost on her that she now worked in the same type of cardiac unit where her father had spent his final days. Every patient she cared for carried a piece of his memory. Every family she comforted reflected her own experience of loss and hope intertwined. She approached each shift with the knowledge that somewhere in these sterile halls, another daughter might be holding her father's hand for the last time. Another son might be praying for one more conversation with his mother. Isabella's dedication hadn't gone entirely unnoticed. Her supervisor, Mrs. Chen, often commented on her intuitive understanding of patient needs, her ability to provide comfort through the smallest gestures. But in a healthcare system stretched thin by budget cuts and staffing shortages, individual excellence often disappeared into the machinery of institutional survival. Isabella understood this reality without bitterness, finding purpose in the work itself rather than recognition from those who managed the numbers. Her patient assignments tonight included room 314, which housed a new admission who had arrived. That afternoon, the chart indicated a 72-year-old male admitted with chest pains and irregular heartbeat. The name read James Morrison, but beyond the basic medical information, the file revealed little about the man lying in the hospital bed. What it didn't capture was the way his weathered hands gripped the bed rails with the controlled tension of someone accustomed to command, or how his steel-grey eyes assessed everything around him with the sharp awareness of a person who had learned to read situations quickly and thoroughly. James Morrison had built his fortune from nothing, starting with a single construction contract after returning from 2 tours in Vietnam. The war had taught him about leadership under pressure, about making life and death decisions with incomplete information, and about the value of loyalty in a world that often rewarded betrayal. Over 5 decades, his company had grown from a small residential contractor to a major commercial development firm, responsible for half the skyline changes in Portland over the past 20 years. Yet success had come with costs that no balance sheet could calculate. His single-minded focus on building an empire had cost him his marriage, created distance from his children, and left him surrounded by people who valued his wealth more than his wisdom. At 72, with a heart that was finally showing signs of the stress he had carried for decades, James found himself questioning what legacy he would leave beyond the buildings that bore his company's name. The heart episode that brought him to Riverside Memorial had occurred during a construction site visit. One moment he had been reviewing blueprints with his foreman, the next he was on the ground, his chest feeling as though it were caught in a vice. The paramedics had been professional and efficient, but there had been something impersonal about their care, something that reminded him uncomfortably of how he had learned to interact with the world. All business, no genuine connection. As Isabella entered room 314 for her initial assessment, she carried with her the same gentle presence that had comforted hundreds of patients over the years. She knocked softly on the partially open door, waiting for permission to enter despite the fact that his care was her responsibility. This small gesture of respect, so automatic to her that she barely registered it, was the first thing that caught James's attention. "Mr. Morrison," she said softly, her voice carrying the warmth that had soothed frightened patients and grieving families alike. "I'm Isabella, your nurse for the evening shift. How are you feeling?" The question wasn't rhetorical, and James recognized immediately that she genuinely wanted to know. In his experience, most people asked about his condition as a formality, their real interest lying in when he might be well enough to return to business. Isabella's question came with patience, as though she had all the time in the world to hear his answer. "Been better," he replied, studying her face for the calculation he usually saw when people learned his name. There was none. Either she didn't recognize him, or she didn't care about his reputation and wealth. Both possibilities intrigued him. Isabella began her assessment with the same methodical care she brought to every patient, but as she worked, she found herself drawn into conversation with this particular man. There was something about his direct manner of speaking, the way he looked her in the eye when she asked questions, that reminded her of her grandfather, who had also been a man of few words, but deep principles. "Have you been to the cardiac unit before?" she asked while checking his blood pressure, making conversation to help him relax. "First time," James replied, then added with characteristic honesty, "hopefully the last." Isabella smiled, recognizing the mixture of fear and bravado that often accompanied first-time cardiac patients. "The doctors here are excellent," she assured him. "Dr. Patel has been practicing cardiology for over 20 years. You're in good hands." As she continued her assessment, James found himself observing not just her professional competence, but the way she moved through the room, adjusting his water pitcher without being asked, straightening his blanket with unconscious care, checking that his call button was within easy reach. These weren't required tasks, but automatic gestures born from genuine concern for his comfort. "You've been doing this long?" he asked, surprising himself with his curiosity about her background. 3 years here," Isabella replied, updating his chart on the rolling computer station. "But it feels like I've been preparing for it my whole life." There was something in her tone that caught his attention, a depth that suggested experience beyond her apparent age. James had learned to recognize strength forged by adversity, and he sensed it in this young nurse who treated him with the same careful attention he imagined she gave to every patient, regardless of their ability to pay or influence to wield. As though Isabella completed her initial assessment and prepared to continue her rounds, she paused at the door. "Is there anything specific that helps you sleep? Music? Extra pillows? Anything at all?" The question caught James off guard. In 72 years, he couldn't remember the last time someone in a professional capacity had asked about his personal preferences rather than his business needs or financial requirements. The caring was genuine, uncalculated, and it stirred something in him that had been dormant for years. "Quiet is good," he said simply, but his eyes followed her as she left the room, already planning how she could ensure his comfort through what she suspected would be a long and anxious night. Neither of them could have imagined that, within 24 hours, their paths would intersect in a way that would expose the prejudice Isabella faced daily and reveal the power James wielded when motivated by genuine respect and righteous anger. The evening shift was ending, but their story together was just beginning, set in motion by the simple recognition that dignity and kindness were currencies more valuable than any amount of money and more powerful than any social status. The clock on the cardiac unit's central station read 11:47 p.m. when Isabella finally completed her medication rounds. Her feet ached in the worn sneakers that had carried her through countless 12-hour shifts, and the small of her back protested. From hours of bending over patients, adjusting equipment, and providing the physical comfort that healing required. Yet despite the fatigue that had settled into her bones, she found herself thinking about the conversation with Mr. Morrison in room 314. There had been something different about their interaction, a quality of attention that she rarely encountered. Most patients, understandably focused on their own conditions and anxious about their diagnoses, treated her as a necessary function rather than a person. Mr. Morrison had looked at her directly, listened to her responses, and asked questions that suggested genuine interest in her as an individual. It was a small thing, perhaps, but after years of feeling invisible within the healthcare system, such moments of recognition carried unexpected weight. Isabella gathered her belongings from the small staff locker room, exchanging tired farewells with the night shift nurses who would continue the care she had begun. The transition between shifts was always a delicate choreography of information transfer, ensuring that every patient's needs would be met seamlessly through the vulnerable hours of the night. She provided detailed updates on Mr. Morrison's condition, noting his stable vitals and the fact that he had finally fallen asleep around 10:30 after expressing concern about the business matters he would miss during his hospitalization. The October night air carried the crisp promise of winter as Isabella walked through the hospital's employee parking garage toward her aging Honda Civic. The car had been her father's, purchased used when she started high school, and though it now showed every one of its 200,000 miles, she maintained it with the same careful attention she brought to her nursing duties. The engine turned over on the third attempt, a ritual she had grown accustomed to, and she waited patiently for the heater to begin combating the evening's chill. As she drove through Portland's quiet streets toward her apartment, Isabella made a decision that would prove more significant than she could have imagined. Instead of heading directly home to the leftover pasta waiting in her refrigerator, she turned toward the Pearl District, where a new restaurant called Meridian had opened 3 months earlier. She had read about it in the local paper, intrigued by the chef's commitment to sustainable ingredients and innovative techniques, but more importantly, drawn by the idea of treating herself to something special after a particularly challenging week. The decision wasn't entirely spontaneous. Tomorrow marked the 2nd anniversary of her father's death, and Isabella had planned to honor his memory by doing something he had always encouraged her to do. But she rarely allowed herself, spending money on her own enjoyment rather than saving every penny for emergencies or her mother's needs. Her father had often said that life was too short to postpone all pleasures until some imaginary future when everything would be secure and perfect. Meridian occupied the ground floor of a converted warehouse, its floor-to-ceiling windows glowing warmly in the darkness. Through the glass, Isabella could see the elegant interior, with exposed brick walls adorned with local artwork, intimate lighting that created pools of warmth around each table. and a central bar where the chef's creative cocktails complemented his innovative cuisine. The clientele appeared to be the young professionals and established business leaders who had gentrified this once industrial neighborhood, people whose clothing and confident postures spoke of financial security and social status. Isabella parked across the street and checked her appearance in the rearview mirror. She had changed from her scrubs into dark jeans and a burgundy sweater, clothes that were clean and presentable, but clearly not expensive. Her dark hair, freed from the practical ponytail required during her shift, fell in soft waves around her shoulders. She looked exactly like what she was, a hard-working young woman who had saved carefully for this small indulgence, someone who belonged in any restaurant, not because of her wealth or status, but because of her fundamental right to be served with respect and dignity. The hostess station stood empty when Isabella entered, but she could see the restaurant was busy, with most tables occupied by couples and small groups engaged in animated conversation. The atmosphere was exactly what she had hoped for: sophisticated but not intimidating, creative but not pretentious. She waited patiently by the hostess station, watching servers move efficiently between tables, delivering plates that looked like small works of art. After several minutes, a young woman approached from the kitchen area, her black dress and confident demeanor marking her as someone with authority in the restaurant's hierarchy. Her name tag read Ashley and included the title Assistant Manager. Isabella smiled warmly as Ashley approached, ready to be seated and begin what she had imagined would be a peaceful meal and a quiet celebration of her father's memory. "Can I help you?" Ashley asked, her tone polite but distant, her eyes already scanning Isabella's appearance with the practiced assessment of someone accustomed to making quick judgments about customers' likely spending power and social standing. "I'd like a table for one, please," Isabella replied, her voice carrying the same gentle confidence she used when speaking with patients and their families. "I don't have a reservation, but I was hoping you might have something available." Ashley's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a subtle tightening around her eyes that Isabella recognized but chose to ignore. "Actually, we're completely booked tonight," Ashley said, gesturing vaguely toward the dining room. "We're really busy with our regular clientele." Isabella glanced around the restaurant, noting several empty tables, including a two-top near the window that she had observed from outside. The lie was obvious, but she had encountered this type of discrimination before, usually in upscale establishments where her age, ethnicity, or obvious lack of designer clothing marked her as someone who didn't belong. She had learned to handle such situations with grace, partly because confrontation rarely changed minds, and partly because she couldn't afford the emotional energy that anger required. "I see some open tables," Isabella said quietly, maintaining her composure despite the familiar sting of rejection. "Would it be possible to wait for one of those?" Ashley's discomfort with the conversation was becoming more apparent, her body language shifting toward defensive aggression. "Those tables are reserved," she said more firmly. "And honestly, I'm not sure this is really the right place for you. We're pretty expensive, and our clientele tends to be more—" She paused, searching for words that would convey her meaning. "Without crossing into obvious discrimination, more established. There's a great diner about 6 blocks down that might be more what you're looking for." The suggestion hit Isabella like a physical blow, not because of its obvious prejudice, but because of how familiar it felt. How many times had she been redirected toward more appropriate establishments, guided away from spaces where her presence might make other customers uncomfortable? How often had her professional competence been questioned because she looked young, or her dedication doubted because she came from a working-class background? Yet even as Ashley's words registered their intended insult, Isabella found herself thinking about the patients she had left in the cardiac unit. people who were facing mortality and uncertainty with courage she could hardly fathom. If they could endure heart procedures and frightening diagnoses with dignity, she could certainly handle one person's narrow-minded prejudice. "I understand," Isabella said simply, her voice steady, despite the humiliation burning in her chest. "Thank you for your time." She turned and walked toward the door with the same measured pace she used when leaving a patient's room, refusing to hurry or show the distress that Ashley's rejection had caused. Behind her, she could hear Ashley speaking in low tones to another staff member, probably sharing the story of how she had successfully deflected an inappropriate customer who might have disturbed the restaurant's carefully cultivated atmosphere. As Isabella reached her car, she sat for a moment in the driver's seat, allowing herself to feel the full impact of what had just occurred. The tears that came weren't just about this evening's rejection, but about the accumulated weight of similar encounters, the constant need to prove her worth in a society that often judged her value by external markers rather than character or competence. She thought about her father, who had faced his own share of discrimination while working to provide for his family, and how he had taught her to respond to prejudice with grace and determination rather than bitterness. Tomorrow, she would return to the hospital and continue caring for patients like Mr. Morrison, people who needed her skills and compassion regardless of her social status or the contents of her bank account. Tonight, she would go home to her modest apartment, heat up the leftover pasta, and remember that her worth wasn't determined by where she was allowed to eat, but by how she treated others and the positive impact she made in the world. As she drove through the quiet streets toward home, Isabella had no way of knowing that her encounter at Meridian would set in motion a chain of events that would transform not just her own life, but the entire landscape of respect and recognition in her community. The night felt like an ending, but it was actually the beginning of something far more significant than she could have imagined. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Isabella's small studio apartment, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors that she had carefully refinished herself during her first month of residency. The light fell across a framed photograph on her nightstand, showing her father in his work uniform, his weathered hands resting on the handle of an industrial vacuum cleaner, his smile radiant with pride despite the humble setting. Today marked exactly 2 years since his funeral, and Isabella had planned to spend the morning at his gravesite before beginning her evening shift at the hospital. She prepared her simple breakfast of oatmeal and coffee with the same methodical care she brought to everything in her life, a ritual that grounded her before facing whatever challenges the day might bring. The events at Meridian the night before had left her with a familiar heaviness, not just from the personal rejection, but from the broader questions it raised about how society determined who deserved dignity and who could be dismissed. Yet, as she sipped her coffee and watched the city wake up through her single window, Isabella found herself returning to the lessons her father had taught her about resilience. "Mija," he had often said during her teenage years, when she came home frustrated by the casual prejudice of classmates or teachers who underestimated her capabilities. "People will always try to tell you what you're worth based on what they can see. Your job is to know your own value so deeply that their opinions become irrelevant." The wisdom of those words had sustained her through nursing school, through the challenges of working in an understaffed hospital, and through countless encounters with people who looked at her uniform and saw only a service worker rather than a skilled professional. This morning, however, the philosophy felt more difficult to embrace. The assistant manager's dismissive suggestion that she belonged in a diner rather than a restaurant had touched something deeper than professional slight. It had felt like an attack on her fundamental right to exist in spaces she had earned through her hard work and saved money. The fact that she could afford to eat at Meridian, that she had researched the restaurant and chosen it specifically for its commitment to quality and innovation, had been irrelevant to Ashley's assessment of her worthiness. Isabella finished her breakfast and dressed for the cemetery visit in clothes that reflected the solemnity of the occasion. A simple black dress that had belonged to her mother, paired with the small gold cross necklace her father had given her for her nursing. School graduation. The drive to Mount Calvary Cemetery took her through neighborhoods that told the story of Portland's economic divide. From the gentrified Pearl District, where she'd been rejected the night before, through working-class areas where families, like hers, had built lives of dignity despite limited resources. Her father's grave was located in a modest section of the cemetery, marked by a simple granite headstone that bore his name, dates, and the inscription, "Beloved Father and Friend." To all, Isabella had chosen those words carefully, remembering how her father had treated everyone he encountered, from wealthy executives whose offices he cleaned to homeless individuals he encountered on his way to work, with the same fundamental respect and kindness. His approach to human dignity had been revolutionary in its simplicity. Every person deserved to be seen, acknowledged, and treated with basic courtesy, regardless of their circumstances. As she knelt beside the grave and arranged the fresh flowers she had brought, Isabella found herself speaking aloud to her father, as she had done every week since his death. She told him about the patients she had cared for, about the small victories and heartbreaking losses that defined her work, about her continuing efforts to honor the values he had instilled in her. When she reached the events of the previous evening, however, her voice caught with unexpected emotion. "I know you'd tell me not to let it matter," she whispered, touching the smooth granite surface of his headstone. "But sometimes it's harder than I thought it would be. Sometimes I wonder if things will ever really change, or if people like me will always have to prove we belong everywhere we go." The October wind rustled through the maple trees that surrounded the cemetery, carrying with it the scent of autumn, leaves, and the distant sounds of the city continuing its daily rhythms. Isabella sat quietly beside her father's grave for nearly an hour, drawing strength from the peaceful surroundings and the memory of his unwavering belief in justice and human dignity. By the time she rose to leave, she had reconnected with the sense of purpose that had guided her through previous challenges. The drive to Riverside Memorial Hospital took her past Meridian, and Isabella found herself slowing as she approached. The restaurant. In the harsh light of day, the establishment looked different, less intimidating, more ordinary, just another business trying to establish itself in a competitive market. She wondered if Ashley would even remember their interaction from the night before, or if turning away customers who didn't fit the desired demographic had become such routine practice that individual encounters blended together into institutional. On policy, the hospital parking garage welcomed her with its familiar mixture of antiseptic scents and the underlying human drama that defined all medical facilities. Isabella changed into her scrubs in the staff locker room, transforming once again into the professional persona that allowed her to navigate the complex hierarchies and emotional demands of healthcare. Her colleagues greeted her with the casual warmth of people who shared the unique stresses and rewards of nursing, but none of them could have guessed the internal battle she had fought that morning between discouragement and determination. The evening shift assignment board showed that she would again be caring for patients in the cardiac intensive care unit, including Mr. Morrison in room 314. According to the day shift report, he had experienced a restful night and was showing positive response to the medication regimen, though he remained frustrated by the forced inactivity that recovery required. His business associates had called throughout the day, seeking updates on his condition and expressing concern about delayed project timelines, but he had insisted that all business communications be handled through his assistant rather than disrupting his medical care. As Isabella approached room 314 to begin her evening assessment, she carried with her the weight of the previous 24 hours, the rejection at Meridian, the emotional visit to her father's grave, and the renewed commitment to treating every patient with the dignity she herself had been denied. She knocked softly on the doorframe before entering, the same gesture of respect that had caught James Morrison's attention during their first meeting. "Good evening, Mr. Morrison," she said warmly. Noting that he appeared more alert than the previous night, his color improved and his breathing less labored. "How are you feeling today?" James looked up from the business magazine he had been attempting to read, his steel-grey eyes immediately focusing on her face with the same direct attention that had surprised her before. "Better," he said simply, then added with characteristic honesty, "though I'd rather be anywhere but here." Isabella smiled, recognizing the common frustration of active people forced into medical passivity. "The doctors are pleased with your progress," she assured him, beginning her systematic check of his vital signs and cardiac monitor readings. "Dr. Patel mentioned that if you continue improving at this rate, you might be able to go home by the weekend." As she worked, James found himself once again observing not just her professional competence, but the quality of presence she brought to her tasks. There was something about her manner that suggested she had weathered recent difficulty with grace, a subtle resilience that spoke of personal experience with adversity. His years in business had taught him to read people quickly and accurately, and he sensed that this young nurse possessed the kind of strength that was forged through genuine hardship rather than manufactured through artificial challenges. "You seem tired tonight," he commented, surprising himself with his directness. "Long day?" Isabella paused in her charting, caught off guard by his perceptiveness. Most patients were so focused on their own conditions that they rarely noticed the emotional state of their caregivers, yet Mr. Morrison seemed genuinely attuned to her well-being. The question opened a door to conversation that she rarely experienced with patients, an opportunity for authentic human connection that transcended the typical boundaries of professional interaction. "It's been a challenging couple of days," she admitted, then quickly redirected the conversation back to his care. "But nothing that should affect your treatment. Is there anything you need to help you rest more comfortably tonight?" James recognized the deflection, but chose not to press further, sensing that whatever burden she carried required careful handling rather than direct interrogation. Instead, he found himself sharing more about his own experience than he typically revealed to medical staff. "I've never been good at sitting still," he said, gesturing toward the cardiac monitor that tracked his every heartbeat. "Built my whole life around staying busy, solving problems, making things happen. This forced rest feels more challenging than the actual heart condition." His honesty created space for Isabella to respond with equal authenticity. "Recovery requires a different kind of strength," she observed, adjusting his pillows to ensure optimal positioning. "Sometimes the hardest work is allowing your body to heal, rather than pushing through discomfort." The conversation continued as she completed her assessment, touching on topics that ranged from the philosophy of healing to the challenge of finding meaning in periods of forced reflection. James found himself drawn to her thoughtful responses and genuine curiosity about his perspective, while Isabella discovered that beneath his reputation as a successful businessman lay a person grappling with questions about legacy and purpose that resonated with her own spiritual struggles. Neither of them realized that their growing mutual respect would soon be tested by an encounter that would reveal the true character of both individuals and set in motion events that would challenge the fundamental assumptions about power, dignity, and justice that shaped their community. The evening shift was progressing smoothly, but the most significant chapter of their story together was about to begin. The third night of James Morrison's stay at Riverside Memorial Hospital brought with it an unexpected restlessness that had nothing to do with his cardiac condition. His vital signs had stabilized beautifully, his chest pain had disappeared entirely, and Dr. Patel had expressed cautious optimism about his recovery timeline. Yet something about his conversations with Isabella Martinez had awakened a curiosity that decades of business success had somehow suppressed. A genuine interest in understanding the lives of people who existed outside his usual circles of wealth and influence. As Isabella entered room 314 for her evening rounds, she carried with her a subtle change in demeanor that James immediately noticed. Where previous nights had brought quiet competence, mixed with gentle warmth, tonight she seemed to move with a more deliberate carefulness, as though she were protecting herself from some invisible threat. Her smile remained genuine, but it didn't quite reach her eyes, and her usual willingness to engage in conversation seemed tempered by an emotional distance that hadn't been present before. "Evening, Mr. Morrison," she said, beginning her routine check of his monitors and medication schedule. "Your numbers look excellent tonight. Dr. Patel is very pleased with your progress." James studied her carefully as she worked, noting the way she avoided prolonged eye contact and how her movements seemed slightly more hurried than usual. His years of negotiating complex business deals had taught him to recognize when someone was operating under stress they were trying to conceal. And every instinct told him that Isabella was carrying a burden she felt unable to share. "Isabella," he said quietly, using her name with the same respect he showed to his most valued business partners. "Is everything all right? You seem different tonight." The directness of his question caught her off guard, and for a moment her professional composure wavered. She had become so accustomed to being invisible within the hospital hierarchy that having a patient notice her emotional state felt both surprising and somehow dangerous. Nurses were expected to provide comfort and care regardless of their personal circumstances, and acknowledging her own struggles felt like a violation of professional boundaries. "I'm fine," she replied automatically, then caught herself in the lie that healthcare workers told countless times each day. Something about James Morrison's steady gaze and genuine concern made her want to offer something more honest. "Actually, it's been a difficult couple of days, but nothing that affects my ability to care for you properly." James recognized the careful balance in her response, an acknowledgement of struggle coupled with reassurance about professional competence. It was exactly the kind of diplomatic answer he might have given to concerned business partners when dealing with personal crises that could affect investor confidence. The parallel struck him as both impressive and troubling, suggesting that Isabella had learned to compartmentalize her emotions with the same ruthless efficiency that had made him successful in business. "Sometimes talking about difficult things helps," he offered, settling back against his pillows in a way that suggested he had time to listen. "I've found that perspective from someone outside a situation can be valuable, even when the problems seem purely personal." Isabella paused in her charting, surprised by the role reversal implied in his words. For 3 nights she had been the one offering comfort and support, helping him process the vulnerability that serious illness created. Now he was extending the same gift to her, creating space for her to be seen as a complete person rather than simply a healthcare provider. The invitation was tempting, but years of maintaining professional boundaries made her hesitant to cross into personal territory. Yet something about the genuine concern in his expression reminded her of her father's ability to make people feel heard and valued regardless of their social status. James Morrison wielded considerable power in the business community, but in this moment he was simply one person offering kindness to another, and Isabella found herself responding to that fundamental human connection. "Yesterday was the anniversary of my father's death," she said quietly, continuing her documentation while she spoke. "I had planned to do something special to honor his memory, but it didn't work out the way I had hoped." She hesitated, then added with careful diplomacy, "Sometimes you realize that certain spaces aren't meant for people like you, no matter how much you might want to belong there." The cryptic nature of her explanation only deepened James's curiosity, but he sensed that pushing for details would shut down the conversation entirely. Instead, he drew on his experience with grieving employees who had lost family members, understanding that sometimes the most helpful response was simply acknowledging the weight of loss. "2 years is still very fresh," he said gently, "especially when it's a parent who shaped your values and work ethic. I can see your father's influence in how you approach patient care, the attention to dignity, the way you treat everyone with equal respect, regardless of their circumstances." Isabella looked up from her charting, surprised by his perceptiveness. Most patients saw only her professional competence, missing entirely the personal philosophy that guided her interactions. That James had recognized the connection between her character and her father's influence suggested a level of emotional intelligence that his reputation as a hard-driving businessman hadn't prepared her to expect. "He taught me that how you treat people when you have nothing to gain from them reveals your true character," she said, her voice carrying the weight of deeply held conviction. "He cleaned office buildings downtown for 20 years, and he always said that he learned more about people's real nature from watching how they behaved when they thought no one important was looking." The wisdom of her father's observation resonated with James in ways that surprised him. His own success had been built partly on his ability to assess character quickly and accurately, yet he realized that his evaluations typically focused on people's reliability in business contexts rather than their fundamental humanity. Isabella's father had been measuring something more essential, the basic decency that determined how individuals treated those who couldn't advance their interests or enhance their status. "That's a profound way to evaluate character," James said thoughtfully. "Your father sounds like he was a wise man who understood human nature better than most people in positions of power." Isabella smiled for the first time that evening, a genuine expression that transformed her tired features. "He would have liked you," she said, surprising herself with the admission. "He always respected people who asked real questions instead of just making conversation. He said that curiosity about other people's experiences was a sign of intelligence and good character." The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the doorframe, followed by the entrance of Dr. Patel making his evening rounds. The elderly cardiologist greeted both Isabella and James warmly, reviewing the patient's chart with the same meticulous attention he brought to every case regardless of the patient's prominence or ability to pay. "Your recovery is progressing beautifully, Mr. Morrison," Dr. Patel announced after completing his examination. "Your heart rhythm has stabilized completely, and your blood work shows excellent response to the medication adjustments. If you continue improving at this rate, I'm confident we can discharge you on Friday morning." James nodded his appreciation for the positive news, but found himself feeling oddly reluctant about leaving the hospital. Not because he enjoyed the institutional environment or the restrictions on his activity, but because departure would mean the end of his conversations with Isabella, interactions that had become the most meaningful part of his days. In her presence, he had rediscovered a capacity for genuine human connection that his business-focused life had gradually eroded. After Dr. Patel left to continue his rounds, Isabella prepared to move on to her next patient, gathering her supplies and updating the computer records with the evening's assessment data. James watched her efficient movements, recognizing that their time together was drawing to a close, but reluctant to let the moment pass without acknowledging what their conversations had meant to him. "Isabella," he said as she prepared to leave, I want you to know that talking with you these past few nights has been the most valuable part of my recovery. Your father raised an exceptional daughter, and any establishment that doesn't recognize your worth is missing something precious." His words carried such sincerity that Isabella felt tears threaten for the first time since her rejection at Meridian. Not tears of sadness, but of recognition, the profound relief that came from being truly seen and valued by another person. In 3 days of professional interaction, James Morrison had offered her more genuine respect and acknowledgement than she received in months of hospital work. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice thick with emotion. "That means more than you know." As she left room 314 to continue her rounds, neither Isabella nor James could have predicted that their growing mutual respect would soon be tested by circumstances that would reveal the true depth of character both possessed. The evening was progressing peacefully, but the most significant chapter of their story was about to unfold in ways that would challenge everything they thought they knew about power, justice, and the courage required to stand up for what was right. The cardiac unit settled into its familiar rhythm of night shift care. But the seeds of transformation had been planted in the honest conversations between a wealthy businessman learning to value human connection and a dedicated nurse, discovering that her worth could be recognized even in the most unlikely circumstances. The 4th morning of James Morrison's hospitalization brought with it an unusual energy that had nothing to do with his medical condition. His cardiac recovery had progressed so well that Dr. Patel had confirmed his Friday discharge, and James found himself experiencing a restlessness that went beyond his typical impatience with inactivity. The conversations with Isabella had awakened something in him that had been dormant for years, a genuine curiosity about the lives and experiences of people who existed outside his insulated world of boardrooms and business deals. As he waited for the morning shift nurse to complete his routine assessment, James made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. Instead of spending another day reviewing quarterly reports and responding to urgent emails from his construction sites, he wanted to understand more about the world that Isabella inhabited when she left the hospital. Not from academic curiosity or business interest, but from a growing recognition that her perspective on human dignity and social justice represented wisdom he had somehow missed during his climb to financial success. The morning shift nurse, an efficient but impersonal woman named Patricia, completed her duties with professional competence, but none of Isabella's warmth or genuine interest in his well-being. The contrast highlighted what James had begun to recognize as Isabella's exceptional gift: her ability to see and respond to the complete person rather than simply the medical condition that required treatment. As Patricia left to continue her rounds, James found himself counting the hours until the evening shift would begin and Isabella would return. By mid-afternoon, his restlessness had evolved into a specific plan. James had built his fortune partly through his willingness to gather information personally rather than relying solely on reports from subordinates, and he decided to apply that same approach to understanding Isabella's world. Using his smartphone, he researched the neighborhoods where she likely lived based on her comments about her family's background and her father's work history. He studied the demographics, the local businesses, the challenges faced by working families in those areas. More specifically, he found himself researching restaurants in the Pearl District, the upscale area that Isabella had mentioned visiting to honor her father's memory. Something about the way she had described the experience, "certain spaces aren't meant for people like you," had suggested an encounter with the kind of casual discrimination that James had rarely witnessed directly, but was beginning to understand as a daily reality for people like Isabella. When evening arrived and Isabella appeared in his doorway for what would likely be their final night together as patient and nurse, James immediately noticed a change in her demeanor. Where previous evenings had brought the weight of personal reflection, tonight she seemed lighter, more at peace with whatever struggle she had been processing. Her smile was genuine and reached her eyes, and her movements carried the confident grace he had noticed during their first meeting. "Good evening, Mr. Morrison," she said warmly, beginning her familiar routine of checking his monitors and reviewing his medication schedule. "This is probably our last evening together. Dr. Patel says you'll be going home tomorrow morning." "James," he corrected gently, as he had done each night. "And yes, though I have to admit I'm going to miss our conversations. You've given me a perspective on healthcare and human dignity that I never would have gained from reading reports or attending board meetings." Isabella paused in her charting, touched by his acknowledgement of their connection. "You've been an exceptional patient," she replied honestly. "It's not often that someone in your position takes the time to really listen and ask thoughtful questions. Most people are too focused on getting back to their regular routines to consider how illness might offer opportunities for reflection and growth." As she continued her assessment, James found himself wrestling with how to ask the question that had been building throughout the day. His curiosity about her experience in the Pearl District wasn't purely academic. Something about her careful diplomacy when describing the encounter suggested injustice that demanded attention, and his years of business experience had taught him that problems left unaddressed typically grew worse over time. "Isabella," he said carefully, "the other night you mentioned trying to do something special to honor your father's memory, but that it didn't work out as planned. I've been thinking about that, and I wondered if you'd be willing to share more details. Sometimes an outside perspective can help clarify whether a situation was handled appropriately." The directness of his question caught Isabella off guard, and she found herself evaluating how much of the Meridian encounter she was willing to share. Her instinct was to maintain the professional boundary that kept personal experiences separate from patient care. But something about James's genuine concern and his track record of thoughtful responses made her consider opening up more completely. "It's probably not worth discussing," she said initially, then caught herself falling back into the pattern of minimizing her own experiences. "Actually, that's not true. It was worth discussing, but I've gotten used to accepting certain kinds of treatment as normal when they really shouldn't be." James waited patiently, recognizing that she was working through internal resistance to sharing something painful. His years of negotiating complex deals had taught him that the most important information often came after people had processed their initial reluctance to reveal difficult truths. "I went to a restaurant called Meridian in the Pearl District," Isabella continued, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of controlled emotion. "It was something I had planned for weeks, a way to celebrate my father's memory by treating myself to something special that he would have encouraged me to do. When I arrived, the assistant manager took one look at me and decided I didn't belong there. The calm way she delivered this information made it somehow more powerful than if she had expressed anger or outrage." James recognized the same controlled professionalism she brought to difficult medical situations, but applied to personal discrimination that would have sent most people into righteous fury. "She told me they were completely booked, even though I could see empty tables," Isabella continued. "When I pointed that out, she said the tables were reserved and then suggested I might be more comfortable at a diner down the street. She made it clear that someone like me wasn't the kind of customer they wanted." James felt a surge of anger that surprised him with its intensity. Not the calculated indignation he might experience when competitors used unfair business practices, but a personal outrage at the injustice done to someone he had come to respect deeply. The fact that Isabella had been judged and rejected based on her appearance rather than her character represented exactly the kind of systemic prejudice that his privileged position had shielded him from witnessing directly. "That's completely unacceptable," he said firmly, his business instincts immediately moving toward problem-solving mode. "Did you file a complaint with the management? Document the interaction? That kind of discrimination violates basic principles of public accommodation, not to mention human decency." Isabella smiled at his immediate move toward action, recognizing the same decisiveness that had probably made him successful in business. "I considered it," she said honestly, "but fighting that kind of battle requires time and energy I don't really have. Plus, proving discrimination is nearly impossible when it's done with careful language and plausible deniability." The assistant manager was smart enough not to say anything explicitly illegal. The pragmatic resignation in her voice troubled James more than outright anger would have. It suggested that Isabella had learned to accept injustice as an inevitable part of her experience, a cost of existing in a world that often judged worth by external markers rather than character or competence. The same strength that made her an exceptional nurse had taught her to absorb discrimination without letting it destroy her spirit, but the cumulative effect of such encounters had to be exhausting. "What was the assistant manager's name?" James asked, his tone shifting toward the focused intensity he brought to serious business matters. Isabella hesitated, recognizing the dangerous territory they were entering. "Mr. Morrison, James, I appreciate your concern, but this isn't something you need to worry about. I've dealt with similar situations before, and I'll deal with them again. It's just part of life for people in my position." "That's exactly the problem," James replied, his voice carrying the conviction that had made him effective in challenging business environments. "It shouldn't be part of life for anyone. And people in my position have a responsibility to speak up when we witness or learn about injustice, especially when we have the resources and influence to address it effectively." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of his dinner tray, delivered by a cheerful volunteer who chatted briefly about the beautiful autumn weather before continuing her rounds. The interruption gave both Isabella and James time to process the significance of what they had discussed and what it might mean for their evolving relationship. As Isabella prepared to continue her rounds with other patients, she found herself genuinely moved by James's reaction to her experience. His immediate anger on her behalf and his instinct to take action represented the kind of allyship that could make real difference in addressing systemic discrimination. Yet she also felt concerned about the potential consequences of involving someone with his resources and influence in what she had learned to handle as a personal rather than systemic issue. "The assistant manager's name was Ashley," she said quietly, surprising herself with the decision to trust him with the information. "But please don't do anything that might make the situation worse. I still have to live and work in this community, and I can't afford to make enemies of people in positions of power." James nodded his understanding, but Isabella could see in his expression that her request for restraint was warring with his instinct to take immediate and decisive action. She had given him information that his business mind was already processing, in terms of strategy and implementation, and she realized that their conversation had set in motion something that neither of them could fully predict or control. "Thank you for trusting me with this," James said simply, "and thank you for everything you've done to make my recovery not just medically successful, but personally meaningful. You've reminded me of values and perspectives that I had somehow lost track of during my focus on business success." As Isabella left room 314 for the last time as his nurse, both she and James understood that their relationship had evolved beyond the typical boundaries of patient care into something approaching genuine friendship and mutual respect. Neither could have predicted that within 24 hours, their connection would be tested by events that would reveal the true character of both individuals and demonstrate the power that comes from combining compassion with influence in service of justice. Friday morning arrived with the crisp clarity that October often brought to Portland, the kind of weather that made the city feel full of possibility and new beginnings. For James Morrison, discharge day represented more than just medical recovery. It marked his return to a world that suddenly seemed different, viewed through the lens of perspectives he had gained during 4 transformative nights at Riverside Memorial Hospital. As he waited for Dr. Patel to complete the final paperwork that would officially release him from medical care, James found his thoughts returning repeatedly to Isabella's account of her treatment at Meridian Restaurant. The business mind that had built his construction empire was already processing the information she had shared, analyzing it from multiple angles, and developing what he recognized as a comprehensive response strategy. Yet this wasn't the calculated approach he might take to a competitor's unfair practices or a contractual dispute with a difficult client. This felt personal in a way that surprised him, driven by genuine affection and respect for Isabella rather than purely strategic considerations. Dr. Patel arrived promptly at 9 a.m., his usual cheerful demeanor brightened by the satisfaction of seeing another successful cardiac recovery. "Mr. Morrison, your progress has been exceptional," he announced, reviewing the final test results one more time. "Your heart rhythm is completely stable, your blood pressure has normalized, and your response to the medication regimen has been textbook perfect. I'm releasing you with complete confidence in your continued recovery." James accepted the discharge instructions and prescription information with appropriate gratitude, but found himself reluctant to leave the environment where he had discovered so much about himself and the world beyond his usual experience. "Dr. Patel," he said as the cardiologist prepared to continue his rounds, "I want you to know that the nursing care I received here, particularly from Isabella Martinez, was extraordinary. She represents the very best of what healthcare can be, when medical expertise is combined with genuine compassion and human dignity." Dr. Patel smiled warmly at the praise. "Isabella is indeed exceptional," he agreed. "We're fortunate to have nurses like her who understand that healing involves much more than just medical treatment. She has a gift for making patients feel seen and valued as complete human beings rather than simply cases to be managed." After Dr. Patel left, James gathered his few personal belongings and prepared for his driver to arrive. His assistant had arranged for the same luxury sedan service he used for important business meetings, but something about returning to that level of insulation from ordinary experience felt wrong after the week's revelations. Instead, he called his driver and requested that they make a detour through the Pearl District before heading to his penthouse apartment. The drive through downtown Portland allowed James to see the city from street level rather than from the elevated perspectives of executive offices and private dining rooms. He observed the morning rhythms of working people heading to jobs that kept the city functioning. Nurses like Isabella finishing night shifts, service workers opening restaurants and shops, construction crews beginning projects that would shape the urban landscape. For the first time in years, he found himself thinking about these individuals as complete people with their own dreams, struggles, and contributions to the community, rather than simply as components in economic systems. When the sedan pulled up in front of Meridian Restaurant, James felt a familiar surge of the focused energy that had made him successful in challenging business negotiations. The establishment looked different in morning light, less intimidating than Isabella had probably found it on that evening when she had been seeking a quiet celebration of her father's memory. Through the large windows, he could see staff preparing for the lunch service, setting tables, and arranging the artistic presentation that upscale restaurants used to justify their premium pricing. James instructed his driver to wait and walked through the front entrance with the confident, bearing that had opened doors throughout his business career. The same hostess station where Isabella had been rejected stood empty, but he could hear voices from the kitchen area and see movement in the dining room as servers prepared for the day's service. The expensive decor and carefully curated atmosphere represented exactly the kind of environment where his presence would be welcomed and his requests accommodated without question. A young man emerged from the kitchen area, his crisp white shirt and black tie marking him as management-level staff. His name tag identified him as Trevor Manager, and his immediate recognition of James's expensive clothing and confident demeanor was visible in the shift to deferential attention that James had grown accustomed to receiving in such establishments. "Good morning, sir," Trevor said warmly, approaching with the practiced hospitality of someone trained to identify and cultivate high-value customers. "I'm Trevor, the general manager. How can I help you today?" James studied Trevor's face carefully, drawing on decades of experience in reading people's character under pressure. "I'm interested in learning about your restaurant's approach to customer service," he said, his tone carrying the measured authority that made people pay attention without immediately triggering defensive responses. "Specifically, how you train your staff to handle walk-in customers who may not fit your typical demographic profile." The question was carefully constructed to seem like a general inquiry rather than an accusation, but James watched Trevor's expression for any sign of recognition or discomfort. The manager's response would determine how he proceeded with the conversation and what kind of intervention might be necessary to address the injustice Isabella had experienced. "We pride ourselves on providing exceptional service to all our guests," Trevor replied smoothly, falling back on the standard language that restaurants use to deflect criticism without making specific commitments. "Our staff is trained to ensure that every customer receives the attention and respect they deserve, regardless of their background or appearance." The practiced nature of Trevor's response suggested that questions about discriminatory treatment weren't entirely unprecedented, which only strengthened James's resolve to pursue the matter more directly. He had built his business reputation partly on his ability to cut through diplomatic language and address core issues with uncomfortable honesty, and this situation seemed to require exactly that approach. "That's an admirable policy," James said, maintaining his measured tone. "I'm curious about how you handle situations where staff members may have personal biases that conflict with that commitment to equal treatment. For instance, if a hostess or assistant manager were to turn away customers based on assumptions about their economic status or social background." Trevor's slight change in posture told James that his question had hit closer to the mark than the manager would have preferred. The defensive stiffening was subtle but unmistakable, suggesting that the restaurant had indeed experienced issues with discriminatory treatment that required careful management. "If such a situation were to occur, we would address it immediately through retraining and corrective action," Trevor said, his tone becoming more cautious. "We have clear policies against discrimination of any kind, and we take allegations of inappropriate behavior very seriously." James recognized the careful language designed to acknowledge concern without admitting liability, exactly the kind of diplomatic response he might have given when faced with similar business challenges. The similarity made him push harder, driven by the recognition that Isabella's experience had been real and significant, even if it was being minimized through institutional defensiveness. "I'm specifically interested in the behavior of an assistant manager named Ashley," James said, abandoning subtle approach in favor of direct confrontation. "A young woman visited your restaurant 3 nights ago, seeking a table for one. Despite visible empty tables, Ashley told her you were completely booked and suggested she might be more comfortable at a diner down the street. The customer was a hospital nurse who had saved money specifically to dine here as a way of honoring her deceased father's memory. The specificity of his account had an immediate impact on Trevor's demeanor. The manager's expression shifted from defensive caution to genuine alarm as he realized that James possessed detailed information about a specific incident rather than making general inquiries about restaurant policies. The change confirmed what James had suspected, that Ashley's behavior toward Isabella had violated both official policy and basic standards of human decency. Sir, if what you're describing actually occurred, it represents a serious violation of our values and training protocols, Trevor said, his voice carrying a mixture of professional concern and personal embarrassment. Could you provide more details about this incident so we can investigate and take appropriate action? James appreciated Trevor's apparent willingness to address the problem, but years of business experience had taught him to evaluate people's responses under pressure rather than simply accepting their initial promises of cooperation. The true test of the restaurant's character would come in how they handled the investigation and what concrete steps they took to prevent similar incidents in the future. The customer in question is Isabella Martinez, a nurse at Riverside Memorial Hospital, James said, providing the information that would allow for proper investigation while also making clear that this wasn't an anonymous complaint that could be easily dismissed. She's a person of exceptional character and professional competence who deserved far better treatment than she received from your staff. Trevor nodded seriously, making notes on his phone while James spoke. Mr. he began, clearly seeking James's identity to better understand the source and significance of the complaint. Morrison, James replied, watching carefully for any recognition of his name and its associated influence in the Portland business community. James Morrison of Morrison Construction and Development. The immediate change in Trevor's expression confirmed that the restaurant manager understood exactly who was raising these concerns and what kind of resources and community influence James could bring to bear if the situation wasn't handled appropriately. The recognition created an opportunity for meaningful action, but also raised questions about whether the response would be driven by genuine commitment to justice or simply fear of negative consequences from a powerful critic. Mr. Morrison, I can assure you that we will investigate this incident thoroughly and take whatever corrective action is necessary, Trevor said, his tone now carrying the urgency that came from understanding the potential business implications of discriminatory behavior. Ashley is scheduled to work this evening, and I will address this matter with her immediately. If your account is accurate, such behavior is completely unacceptable and will result in immediate disciplinary action. James nodded his appreciation for Trevor's apparent commitment to addressing the problem, but he also recognized that true change would require more than just disciplinary action against one employee. Systemic issues required systemic solutions, and his business experience had taught him that lasting transformation came through comprehensive policy changes rather than isolated interventions. I appreciate your willingness to investigate, James said, but I'm also interested in what steps you'll take to ensure that all customers receive respectful treatment, regardless of their appearance or perceived economic status. This incident suggests training gaps that extend beyond one employee's poor judgment. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with James using his business expertise to guide Trevor toward commitments that would create meaningful change in how the restaurant approached customer service and staff training. By the time he left Meridian, James had extracted promises for comprehensive policy review. enhanced sensitivity training, and regular monitoring to ensure consistent implementation of respectful treatment for all customers. As his driver navigated the morning traffic toward his penthouse apartment, James found himself thinking about Isabella's reaction when she learned about his intervention. He hoped she would understand that his actions came from genuine respect and affection rather than paternalistic assumption that she couldn't handle her own challenges. The line between supportive allyship and presumptuous interference was delicate, and he wanted to ensure that his response honored her dignity while also addressing the injustice she had experienced. The afternoon sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of James Morrison's penthouse apartment, casting geometric patterns across the polished hardwood floors and expensive furniture that had been carefully selected by an interior designer he rarely saw. For the first time in months, James found himself actually noticing his living space rather than simply moving through it as a necessary pause between business obligations. The silence that usually provided respite from constant meetings and phone calls now felt oddly hollow, lacking the purposeful energy that had characterized his conversations with Isabella during his hospital stay. James settled into his leather armchair overlooking the Willamette River, but instead of reaching for the stack of quarterly reports that his assistant had delivered that morning, he found himself replaying his conversation with Trevor at Meridian Restaurant. The manager's immediate shift from defensive caution to urgent concern when he learned James's identity had been predictable but also troubling, highlighting the reality that complaints carried different weight depending on who raised them. Isabella's experience would likely have been dismissed or minimized if she had complained directly, but his intervention as a prominent businessman had triggered immediate promises of investigation and policy reform. The disparity bothered him more than he had expected, not because he regretted using his influence to address injustice, but because it underscored how systematically the voices of people like Isabella were discounted while his own opinions carried disproportionate weight, regardless of their merit. The recognition forced him to confront uncomfortable questions about how many other instances of discrimination he had unknowingly benefited from, simply by existing in spaces where his presence was automatically welcomed and respected. His phone buzzed with a text message from his assistant reminding him about a 3 p.m. conference call with investors interested in his latest downtown development project. The meeting would determine whether to proceed with a mixed-use complex that would bring both commercial space and affordable housing to a neighborhood currently experiencing rapid gentrification. Under normal circumstances, James would have spent the morning reviewing financial projections and market analysis to prepare for the presentation. Today, however, he found himself thinking about the broader social implications of development decisions that he had previously evaluated purely through economic metrics. The irony wasn't lost on him that his conversation with Isabella about dignity and human worth was now influencing his approach to a business decision that would affect hundreds of families' access to affordable housing in Portland. Her father's wisdom about judging character through how people treated those who couldn't advance their interests suddenly seemed directly relevant to how developers approached community impact versus profit maximization. James opened his laptop and began reviewing the project materials, but with a different lens than he had used in previous development decisions. Instead of focusing exclusively on return on investment and construction timelines, he found himself considering questions that Isabella might ask. How would this project affect existing residents? Would it create opportunities for people like her family, or would it accelerate displacement that pushed working families further from the urban core, where jobs and services were concentrated? The analysis revealed complexities that his previous purely financial approach had overlooked, While the development would generate substantial profits and create jobs during construction, it would also contribute to rental market pressures that might force out exactly the kind of hard-working families that Isabella represented. The recognition challenged him to consider whether his responsibility as a developer extended beyond legal compliance and financial success to include broader social impact and community stewardship. As he prepared for the investor call, James made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. Instead of presenting the project purely as a financial opportunity, he would frame it as a chance to demonstrate that profitable development could also contribute to community stability and economic diversity. The approach carried risks. Some investors might be less interested in projects that prioritized social impact alongside financial returns, but it also offered the possibility of building something more meaningful than another generic luxury complex. The conference call began promptly at 3 p.m., with 6 investors joining from various locations across the Pacific Northwest. James had worked with most of them on previous projects, and their participation represented substantial capital that could make or break the development timeline. As he began his presentation, however, he found himself departing from the prepared script to include considerations that had never appeared in his previous investor pitches. "This project offers excellent financial returns," James began, displaying the market analysis and projected revenue streams that formed the foundation of any successful development pitch. But it also presents an opportunity to demonstrate that responsible development can enhance rather than displace existing communities, while still generating substantial profits for investors. The slight pause that followed his comment told James that his framing had surprised the investors, who were accustomed to presentations that focused exclusively on market opportunities and risk mitigation. He pressed forward, drawing on insights that his conversations with Isabella had provided about the challenges facing working families in an increasingly expensive housing market. Current market conditions are driving service workers, healthcare employees, teachers, and other essential personnel out of urban centers where they work, James continued, thinking specifically about nurses like Isabella, who struggled to afford housing near the hospitals where their skills were desperately needed. This development can address that challenge by including workforce housing alongside market-rate units, creating a stable tenant base while contributing to community sustainability. The questions that followed revealed the tension between purely profit-driven development and approaches that considered broader social impact. Some investors expressed concern about reduced returns if affordable units were included in the project mix, while others seemed intrigued by the possibility of positive community relations and potential tax incentives for inclusive development practices. James found himself arguing passionately for the inclusive approach, drawing on examples of successful mixed-income developments in other cities and emphasizing the long-term benefits of community partnerships over short-term profit maximization. The conversation stretched beyond its scheduled hour as investors grappled with evaluating projects through criteria that extended beyond traditional financial metrics. When the call finally ended, James realized that his presentation had reflected a fundamental shift in how he approached both business decisions and community responsibility. Isabella's influence had been subtle but profound, challenging him to consider questions about dignity, opportunity, and social justice that had been absent from his previous development philosophy. The remainder of the afternoon was interrupted by a phone call from Trevor at Meridian Restaurant, reporting on his investigation into Ashley's treatment of Isabella. The manager's findings confirmed James's suspicions that the incident represented more than isolated poor judgment by a single employee, revealing patterns of behavior that suggested systemic issues with training and accountability. Ashley admitted to turning away several customers over the past few months based on her assessment of their likelihood to order expensive items or leave substantial tips, Trevor reported, his voice carrying genuine embarrassment about the discriminatory practices that had apparently been occurring under his management. She claimed she was protecting the restaurant's atmosphere and maximizing revenue per table, but obviously her approach violated both our stated policies and basic principles of equal treatment. James listened to the details of Trevor's investigation with growing anger, not just about Isabella's specific experience, but about the broader pattern of discrimination that the manager's findings revealed. The systematic nature of Ashley's behavior suggested that other customers had been subjected to similar treatment, creating an institutional culture that prioritized perceived economic value over human dignity. "What disciplinary action are you taking?" James asked, his tone carrying the focused intensity that had made him effective in challenging business negotiations. "Ashley has been terminated immediately," Trevor replied. "We're also implementing comprehensive sensitivity training for all front-of-house staff, revising our customer service policies to explicitly prohibit discrimination based on appearance or perceived economic status, and establishing regular monitoring procedures to ensure consistent implementation of respectful treatment for all customers." While James appreciated the concrete steps that Trevor was taking to address the problem, he found himself thinking about Isabella's reaction to these developments. His intervention had achieved the immediate goal of holding the restaurant accountable for discriminatory behavior, but it had also created a situation where she might feel that her personal experience had been used without her consent to justify actions that could affect other people's employment and livelihood. The complexity of the situation reflected broader questions about how people with privilege and influence should respond when they witnessed or learned about injustice. The effectiveness of his intervention was undeniable. Changes were being implemented that would protect future customers from the discrimination Isabella had experienced. Yet the fact that his complaint had triggered immediate action while hers would likely have been dismissed revealed systematic inequalities that his individual response couldn't fully address. As evening approached, James found himself thinking about Isabella beginning another shift at Riverside Memorial Hospital, probably unaware that her account of discrimination had already resulted in policy changes and personnel decisions at Meridian Restaurant. He wondered how she would react to learning about his intervention, whether she would appreciate his efforts to address the injustice or feel that he had overstepped boundaries by taking action without her explicit permission. The question highlighted the delicate balance between supportive allyship and presumptuous interference that characterized many efforts by privileged individuals to address discrimination affecting marginalized communities. James's intentions had been driven by genuine respect and affection for Isabella, but the impact of his actions extended beyond their personal relationship to affect other employees and the broader restaurant industry's approach to customer service. Training. His phone buzzed with another message from his assistant, reminding him about a dinner meeting with potential investors for a different development project. Under normal circumstances, James would have welcomed the opportunity to discuss new business ventures and explore possibilities for expanding his construction empire. Tonight, however, he found himself reluctant to engage in conversations that would inevitably focus on profit margins and market positioning rather than the questions about social responsibility and community impact that Isabella had awakened. In his thinking, instead of heading to the scheduled dinner, James made a decision that would have surprised his business associates and probably concerned his assistant. He drove back to Riverside Memorial Hospital, not as a patient seeking medical care, but as someone hoping to continue a conversation that had already transformed his perspective on success, responsibility, and the true meaning of worth in a world that too often measured value through wealth rather than character. The evening shift was beginning as he arrived at the hospital, and James found himself walking through corridors that had become familiar during his stay, heading toward the cardiac unit, where Isabella would be beginning another night of providing the kind of compassionate care that had opened his eyes to what healthcare could be when medical expertise was combined with genuine human dignity. The cardiac intensive care unit at Riverside Memorial Hospital hummed with its familiar evening rhythm as Isabella Martinez began her shift, moving through the corridors with the same quiet confidence that had characterized her work for over 3 years. Tonight felt different, however, marked by an underlying sadness that came from knowing she would no longer be caring for James Morrison, whose discharge that morning had ended the most meaningful patient relationship she had experienced in her nursing career. The empty room 314 served as a reminder of how rare it was to encounter someone who saw beyond her uniform, to recognize her as a complete person, worthy of respect and genuine interest. Isabella had spent the day reflecting on their conversations and the unexpected friendship that had developed during his stay. James's immediate anger upon learning about her treatment at Meridian Restaurant had touched something deep within her, not because she needed someone to fight her battles, but because his reaction represented the kind of allyship that could make real difference in addressing systemic discrimination. Too often, people with privilege remained unaware of the daily indignities faced by those with less power, and James's willingness to listen and respond with genuine outrage suggested a level of character that transcended his business reputation. As she checked on her current patients, Isabella found herself thinking about the broader questions their conversations had raised about dignity, recognition, and social justice. James had forced her to articulate experiences and observations that she usually processed internally, helping her understand that her individual encounters with discrimination were part of larger patterns that affected countless others in similar circumstances. The recognition was both empowering and overwhelming, suggesting possibilities for change, while also highlighting the magnitude of systemic challenges that required far more than individual responses. Her contemplation was interrupted by a commotion at the unit's main entrance, where she could hear unfamiliar voices speaking in urgent tones with the charge nurse. Isabella glanced toward the sound, curious about what might be causing such unusual activity during the typically quieter evening hours. What she saw made her stop in her tracks, her professional composure momentarily shaken by the unexpected. Sight of James Morrison standing at the nurse's station, engaged in animated conversation with her supervisor. James was not alone. Behind him stood 2 men in expensive suits, their bearing and demeanor suggesting they were business associates or legal representatives rather than family members. More striking was what Isabella could see through the unit's windows. 2 gleaming Bentley automobiles parked in the hospital's patient pickup area, their polished surfaces reflecting the evening lights and drawing curious stares from passers-by. The vehicles represented a level of wealth and status that seemed almost surreal in the context of the working-class hospital where Isabella had built her career. As she approached the nurse's station, Isabella caught fragments of conversation that made her heart race with a mixture of anticipation and concern. James was speaking with quiet intensity about addressing systemic issues and ensuring accountability, while her supervisor nodded with the slightly overwhelmed expression of someone trying to process unexpected developments that extended far beyond routine hospital operations. "Isabella," James said warmly as he noticed her approach, his face lighting up with genuine pleasure at seeing her again. "I was hoping I might have a chance to speak with you before your shift gets too Busy. There are some developments regarding our conversation last night that I think you should know about. The formal way he addressed her in front of her supervisor told Isabella that whatever he wanted to discuss was significant enough to require careful handling. She nodded professionally, though her mind was racing with questions about what kind of developments could have warranted his return to the hospital with such obvious display of resources and influence. "Of course, Mr. Morrison," she replied, maintaining the professional boundaries that hospital protocol required while acknowledging their personal connection through subtle warmth in her tone. "I have a few minutes before my next medication round." James gestured toward a small family consultation room adjacent to the nurse's station, the kind of private space where doctors delivered serious diagnoses and families processed life-changing news. As they walked toward the room, Isabella was acutely aware of the curious stares from her colleagues, who were clearly wondering what business a recently discharged patient might have with one of their nurses that required such formal discussion. Once they were seated in the consultation room, James's demeanor shifted from the careful formality he had maintained in front of her supervisor to the genuine warmth and respect that had characterized their previous conversations. Yet there was also something else in his expression, a combination of satisfaction and concern that suggested he had taken action that might have complicated consequences. "Isabella," he began, his voice carrying the same direct honesty that had made their hospital conversations so meaningful. "I want you to know that after our discussion last night, I felt compelled to address the situation you experienced at Meridian Restaurant. I hope you'll understand that my actions came from genuine respect for you and concern about the injustice you described, not from any assumption that you couldn't handle the situation yourself." The careful way he framed his opening told Isabella that whatever he had done was significant enough to potentially affect her life in ways she hadn't anticipated. She felt a flutter of anxiety mixed with curiosity, uncertain whether to be grateful for his intervention or concerned about the potential ramifications of involving someone with his resources and influence in what she had learned to handle as a personal rather than public matter. "What kind of action did you take?" she asked, her nursing training helping her maintain composure while processing potentially overwhelming information. James leaned forward slightly, his expression serious but warm. "I visited Meridian this morning and spoke directly with the general manager about Ashley's behavior toward you. I provided specific details about your experience and made it clear that such discrimination was completely unacceptable. The manager conducted an immediate investigation, and Ashley has been terminated from her position." The news hit Isabella with unexpected force, creating a complex mixture of vindication, concern, and something approaching fear. While part of her felt satisfied that Ashley's discriminatory behavior had been addressed, another part worried about the implications of having someone lose their job based on her account of events, especially when that account had been shared without her explicit permission to take such dramatic action. "I appreciate your concern," Isabella said carefully, "but I'm not sure I'm comfortable with someone losing their employment because of my experience. Ashley's behavior was wrong, but I don't know if termination was proportionate to what happened." James nodded, recognizing the compassion that made her worry about even someone who had treated her poorly. "I understand your concern, and it speaks to your character that you're thinking about Ashley's welfare even after how she treated you. But according to the investigation, your experience wasn't isolated. Ashley had been systematically turning away customers she deemed inappropriate for the restaurant's image, violating both company policy and basic principles of equal treatment. The revelation that her experience had been part of a pattern rather than an isolated incident changed Isabella's perspective on the consequences Ashley had faced. If multiple customers had been subjected to similar discrimination, then the termination represented accountability for systematic misconduct rather than disproportionate punishment for a single poor decision. What other changes are being implemented? Isabella asked, beginning to understand that James's intervention had extended beyond just addressing Ashley's individual behavior. Comprehensive sensitivity training for all staff, revised customer service policies that explicitly prohibit discrimination, and regular monitoring to ensure consistent implementation, James replied, pulling out his phone to show her a formal letter from Meridian's management. But more importantly, I've arranged for something that I hope will address the original injustice you experienced. James's pause suggested that whatever he was about to reveal represented the most significant aspect of his intervention. Isabella waited, her anxiety increasing as she tried to anticipate what kind of arrangement someone with his resources might have made on her behalf. Tomorrow evening, you're invited to dine at Meridian as their guest, James continued, his voice carrying quiet satisfaction. The general manager has personally guaranteed that you'll receive their finest service, and they're comping your entire meal as an apology for Ashley's treatment. But more than that, they want to publicly acknowledge their commitment to serving all customers with equal respect and dignity. The offer was generous and thoughtful, addressing both the personal injustice Isabella had experienced and the broader principle that all customers deserved equal treatment, regardless of their appearance or perceived economic status. Yet something about the arrangement also made her uncomfortable, creating a situation where her private experience became part of a public demonstration of corporate responsibility. "That's very kind," Isabella said slowly, "but I'm not sure I want to be part of a public relations effort to rehabilitate the restaurant's reputation. I just wanted to be treated with basic respect, not to become a symbol of their commitment to diversity and inclusion." James's expression showed that he had anticipated her reluctance and respected the boundary she was drawing between personal justice and public demonstration. "I completely understand," he said. "The invitation stands if you choose to accept it, but there's no pressure or expectation that you participate in any kind of public acknowledgement. Your dignity and comfort are far more important than the restaurant's desire to demonstrate their reformed policies." Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the consultation room door, followed by the entrance of Isabella's supervisor. With an expression that mixed professional courtesy with obvious curiosity about the unusual situation unfolding during her shift. "I'm sorry to interrupt," the charge nurse said, "but there are some gentlemen in the lobby asking to speak with Isabella. They say they're from a television news station, and they've heard about some kind of discrimination incident involving one of our nurses." The news hit both Isabella and James with immediate concern. Neither had anticipated that his intervention at Meridian might attract media attention, and the prospect of unwanted publicity created complications that extended far beyond their personal relationship or even the restaurant's policies. "I didn't contact any media," James said quickly, his business instincts immediately moving toward damage control. "But news travels fast in business circles, and someone may have leaked information about the situation." Isabella felt her anxiety spike as she contemplated the possibility of her private experience becoming a public news story. Her work at the hospital required her to maintain professional boundaries and avoid controversies that might affect her relationships with patients and colleagues. Media attention about discrimination could create exactly the kind of visibility she had spent her career trying to avoid. "I need to think about this," Isabella said, rising from her chair with the decisive movement that had served her well in medical emergencies. "I appreciate everything you've done, James, but I need to process what this means for my life and my work before I make any decisions about how to respond." James stood as well, his expression reflecting understanding of her position and respect for her need to control how her story was told. "Of course," he said, "and please know that whatever you decide, I'll support your choice completely. You have my phone number if you want to discuss anything, or if you need any assistance in dealing with media inquiries." As they left the consultation room together, Isabella was struck by how much her life had changed in the span of a week. What had begun as routine patient care had evolved into a friendship that challenged her assumptions about wealth and privilege, and was now threatening to become a public story about discrimination and social justice that could affect her career and personal privacy in ways she couldn't fully predict. The two Bentleys still waited in the hospital parking area, their presence a visible reminder of the resources and influence that James could bring to bear when motivated by genuine concern for justice. As Isabella watched him walk toward the vehicles, accompanied by his business associates who had waited patiently during their conversation, she found herself grappling with questions about power, privilege, and the complex dynamics of allyship that extended far beyond her individual experience. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and decisions that would test her ability to navigate between personal privacy and public advocacy, between gratitude for James's support and concern about the uncontrolled consequences of his intervention. Tonight, however, she had patients to care for and professional duties to fulfill, grounding herself in the work that had always provided meaning and purpose, regardless of the external circumstances that threatened to disrupt her carefully maintained boundaries between public service and private life. The following Monday morning brought an unexpected transformation to the usually quiet corridors of Riverside Memorial Hospital. Isabella arrived for her evening shift to find the administrative offices buzzing with activity that seemed far removed from the typical rhythms of patient care and medical procedures. As she changed into her scrubs in the staff locker room, her colleagues whispered among themselves about news crews that had been calling throughout the day, seeking interviews about a discrimination incident involving one of their nurses. Isabella had spent the weekend grappling with the media attention that James's intervention had unexpectedly generated. Saturday morning had brought a knock on her apartment door from a local television reporter, followed by phone calls from 3 different news outlets seeking her perspective on what they were calling a powerful businessman's fight against restaurant discrimination. The story had apparently spread through Portland's business community with surprising speed, fueled by James Morrison's reputation and the dramatic nature of his response to Isabella's treatment. What troubled Isabella most was how quickly her personal experience had been transformed into a public narrative that she felt little control over. The reporters who contacted her seemed more interested in the dramatic elements of the story: the wealthy businessman, the luxury cars, the swift corporate response, than in the systemic discrimination that affected countless service workers, healthcare employees, and other people whose daily experiences rarely attracted media attention. She had declined all interview requests, explaining that she needed time to process the situation and its implications for her work and personal life. Yet even her silence had become part of the story, with one reporter characterizing her reluctance to speak as the humble dignity of a hard-working nurse who doesn't seek recognition for simply doing her job. The description, while flattering, felt like another form of objectification that reduced her complex response to media-friendly characterization. As Isabella made her way to the cardiac unit for shift report, she was intercepted by Mrs. Chen, the nursing supervisor who had overseen her work since she joined the hospital staff 3 years earlier. Mrs. Chen's expression combined professional concern with genuine affection, reflecting the mentoring relationship that had developed between them over the years. "Isabella," Mrs. Chen said, guiding her toward a quiet alcove away from the busy nurses' station. "I wanted to check in with you about all this media attention." I know this isn't something you sought, and I want to make sure you feel supported as you navigate whatever decisions you need to make. The supervisor's understanding approach provided a relief that Isabella hadn't realized she needed. Throughout the weekend, she had felt increasingly isolated as the story took on a life of its own, spinning beyond her ability to control or even influence how her experience was being portrayed to the public. "I appreciate that," Isabella replied honestly. "I'm still trying to understand how a private conversation became such a public story. I never intended for any of this to happen, and I'm not sure how to handle the attention in a way that protects both my privacy and my professional responsibilities here." Mrs. Chen nodded, with the wisdom of someone who had helped numerous staff members navigate unexpected challenges over her decades in nursing leadership. "The hospital administration is completely supportive of you, regardless of what you decide about media requests or public involvement," she assured Isabella. "Your work here speaks for itself, and nothing about this situation changes our appreciation for your contributions to patient care." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Patel, who had apparently been looking for Isabella since learning about the weekend's developments. His usually cheerful demeanor carried an additional warmth that suggested he had been following the story with personal as well as professional interest. "Isabella," Dr. Patel said, his accented English carrying the same gentle authority that made patients trust him implicitly, "I wanted you to know that several of us in the medical staff have been discussing this situation, and we're all very proud of how you've conducted yourself. What happened to you was completely unacceptable, and we're glad that someone with influence was willing to take action." The cardiologist's support meant more to Isabella than he probably realized. Dr. Patel's reputation for integrity and patient advocacy made his endorsement carry significant weight within the hospital community, and his willingness to publicly support her helped counter any concerns about negative professional repercussions from the media attention. "Thank you, Dr. Patel," Isabella replied. "I hope this situation doesn't create any complications for the hospital or affect my ability to continue providing good patient care." "Quite the opposite," Dr. Patel assured her. "If anything, this story highlights the kind of character and professionalism that makes our nursing staff exceptional. You represent the very best of what healthcare can be when medical expertise is combined with genuine compassion and dignity." As Dr. Patel continued his rounds and Mrs. Chen returned to her administrative duties, Isabella began her evening assessment of patients, finding comfort in the familiar routines that had sustained her through previous challenges. The work itself remained unchanged, checking vital signs, administering medications, providing comfort to people facing illness and uncertainty. Yet she found herself more aware than usual of how her interactions with patients and families reflected the values that had guided her throughout her nursing career. Her first patient of the evening was Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly woman recovering from bypass surgery whose limited English had made communication with some staff members challenging. Isabella's fluent Spanish allowed for detailed conversations about pain management, dietary concerns, and the anxiety that often accompanied cardiac procedures. As she helped Mrs. Rodriguez understand her medication schedule and recovery timeline, Isabella was reminded of why she had chosen nursing as a profession, the opportunity to provide not just medical care, but genuine human connection during vulnerable moments. "Enfermera Isabella," Mrs. Rodriguez said, using the formal address that reflected both respect and affection. "My daughter told me she saw you on the television news. She said you're famous now for standing up for people like us." The comment caught Isabella off guard, highlighting how the media coverage had reached even into the patient population at the hospital. She felt uncomfortable with the characterization of being famous, but recognized that Mrs. Rodriguez's perspective offered insight into how the story was being received within the Latino community that formed a significant portion of the hospital's patient base. "I'm not famous," Isabella replied gently in Spanish, adjusting Mrs. Rodriguez's pillows for better comfort. "I just had an experience that someone with influence decided to address. The important thing is that we continue to treat each other with respect and dignity, regardless of our backgrounds or circumstances." Mrs. Rodriguez nodded sagely, her weathered hands reaching to pat Isabella's arm, with the familiarity of someone recognizing shared values and experiences. "My daughter works in a restaurant downtown," she said. "She told me that after your story came out, her manager held a meeting about treating all customers with respect. Maybe good things can come from bad experiences." The revelation that Isabella's experience had already influenced policy discussions at other restaurants provided a perspective she hadn't considered. While she remained uncomfortable with the public attention, the possibility that her story might contribute to positive changes for other service workers offered a new way of thinking about the situation's broader implications. Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of a flower delivery person carrying an elaborate arrangement that seemed almost out of place in the hospital's utilitarian environment. The delivery person checked his clipboard carefully before approaching Isabella with obvious uncertainty about whether he had found the correct recipient. "Isabella Martinez?" he asked, clearly surprised to be delivering such an expensive arrangement to a nurse during her working shift. "These are for you, with a card from—" He paused to check the delivery slip. "Meridian Restaurant." Isabella accepted the flowers with growing bewilderment, recognizing that the arrangement represented a public gesture that extended beyond the private apology she had expected from the restaurant's management. The attached card contained a formal message from Trevor, the general manager, expressing deep regret for her treatment and reiterating the restaurant's commitment to serving all customers with equal respect and dignity. More significantly, the card included an invitation to visit Meridian as their guest whenever she felt comfortable doing so, with no pressure for publicity or public acknowledgement of the gesture. The tone was respectful and genuine, suggesting that the restaurant's response had evolved beyond mere damage control to include authentic recognition of the wrong that had been done. As Isabella placed the flowers at the nurse's station, she became aware that her colleagues were watching with curiosity and what appeared to be genuine pride in her recognition. Several nurses approached to read the card and express support for how she had handled the situation, with some sharing their own experiences of discrimination in various settings throughout the city. "You know," said Janet, a veteran nurse who had worked at the hospital for over 15 years, "I've been turned away from places because they thought I couldn't afford to eat there just based on seeing my scrubs or my car. It feels good to see someone finally call out that kind of behavior and make them accountable." The conversation that followed revealed that Isabella's experience had resonated with numerous staff members who had faced similar discrimination but had never felt empowered to address it directly. The collective sharing created an unexpected sense of community and validation, helping Isabella understand that her story had provided a voice for experiences that were far more common than she had realized. As the evening progressed, Isabella found herself thinking about James Morrison and how his intervention had set in motion changes that extended far beyond their individual relationship. His willingness to use his privilege and influence to address injustice had created ripple effects that were already influencing policy discussions, staff training, and community conversations about dignity and respect in customer service. Yet, she also recognized that the most meaningful aspect of their encounter hadn't been his ability to generate media attention or force corporate policy changes, but rather his genuine recognition of her worth as a person deserving of respect and consideration. That basic acknowledgement of her dignity had been more valuable than any flowers or public apologies, representing the kind of human connection that transcended differences in wealth, status, or social position. Her shift ended with a phone call from James, who had apparently been following the media coverage and wanted to check on how she was handling the unexpected attention. His voice carried genuine concern, mixed with what sounded like regret about the public dimensions that his intervention had assumed. "Isabella," he said, his tone reflecting the same respect and warmth that had characterized their hospital conversations, "I want you to know that I never intended for this to become such a public story. If the media attention is creating problems for you, I'm prepared to make a public statement, redirecting focus away from your personal experience." The offer demonstrated his understanding of her discomfort with publicity and his willingness to use his influence to protect her privacy rather than capitalize on the positive coverage his intervention had generated. The gesture reinforced her assessment of his character and helped her feel more confident about navigating the ongoing attention with dignity and purpose. "I appreciate that," Isabella replied. "But I'm beginning to think that maybe some good can come from people hearing about these experiences. If it helps other workers feel empowered to speak up about discrimination or encourages businesses to examine their own practices, then perhaps the discomfort of publicity is worth enduring." Their conversation continued for 20 minutes, covering everything from media strategy to the broader questions about social justice and community responsibility that their relationship had raised. By the time Isabella hung up the phone, she had reached a decision about how to proceed with the attention her story had generated, guided by the same values that had shaped her approach to nursing and her commitment to treating all people with dignity and respect. The following Wednesday evening marked exactly 1 week since James Morrison's discharge from Riverside Memorial Hospital, and Isabella found herself standing outside Meridian Restaurant with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness that had nothing to do with her previous rejection at the same establishment. This time, she wasn't alone. James had asked if he could accompany her for what he called a proper celebration of your father's memory, and Isabella had agreed, recognizing that their friendship had evolved beyond the circumstances that had brought them together. The October evening carried the crisp promise of winter, and Isabella had chosen to wear the same burgundy sweater and dark jeans she had worn during her original visit, a deliberate decision to honor her authentic self, rather than conforming to anyone else's expectations about appropriate restaurant attire. James arrived precisely on time, stepping out of one of his Bentleys with a warm smile that immediately put her at ease. "You look perfect," he said simply, offering his arm with the same genuine respect he had shown throughout their relationship. "Are you ready for this?" Isabella nodded, though she felt her heart racing as they approached the entrance where Ashley had rejected her just 10 days earlier. The hostess station was now staffed by a different young woman, whose immediate warm greeting suggested that Isabella's arrival had been anticipated and prepared for with careful attention to ensuring a welcoming experience. "Ms. Martinez," the new hostess said with genuine enthusiasm, "welcome to Meridian. I'm Sarah, and we're honored to have you dining with us this evening. Your table is ready whenever you'd like to be seated." The transformation was immediately apparent. Where Isabella's previous visit had been met with calculated assessment and eventual rejection, tonight brought professional hospitality that felt both authentic and respectful. As Sarah led them through the dining room toward a window table overlooking the Pearl District's evening lights, Isabella noticed other diners glancing their way with curiosity, but no hostility. Trevor, the general manager, approached their table. Shortly after they were seated, his expression combining professional courtesy with what appeared to be genuine remorse about Isabella's previous experience. "Ms. Martinez, Mr. Morrison," he said, I want to personally apologize again for the treatment you received during your last visit. We've implemented comprehensive changes to ensure that all guests receive the respect and hospitality they deserve. Isabella appreciated the sincerity of his apology, but she also wanted to ensure that the evening focused on celebration rather than dwelling on past injustices. "Thank you, Trevor," she replied graciously. "I'm grateful for the changes you've made, and I'm looking forward to experiencing what your restaurant has to offer." As they reviewed the menu and ordered their meals, Isabella and James found themselves settling into the same comfortable conversation that had characterized their hospital discussions. Yet tonight felt different, marking a transition from their patient-nurse relationship to something approaching genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared values about human dignity and social responsibility. "I've been thinking about our conversations," James said, over appetizers that were beautifully presented and expertly prepared, "and how they've influenced my approach to business decisions. That development project I mentioned, I convinced the investors to include 30% affordable housing units, specifically targeting essential workers like teachers, nurses, and service employees." Isabella looked up from her meal with surprise and genuine delight. "That's wonderful," she said. "Those are exactly the people who get pushed out when neighborhoods gentrify, even though they're the ones who keep the community functioning." Their conversation was interrupted by Sarah, who approached with obvious excitement and a certain nervousness. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, "but I wanted you to know that we've had several other customers tonight who specifically mentioned hearing about your story and wanting to support businesses that treat all customers with respect. Your experience has actually brought positive attention to our commitment to inclusive hospitality. The revelation that Isabella's story was drawing customers who valued inclusive practices provided an unexpected perspective on how personal experiences of discrimination could contribute to broader social change. Rather than simply being a victim of prejudice, she had become an inadvertent catalyst for conversations about dignity, respect, and community values that extended far beyond restaurant policies. As they enjoyed their main courses, Isabella found herself reflecting on how dramatically her life had changed since that night when she had been turned away from this same restaurant. What had begun as a personal humiliation had evolved into a broader conversation about social justice that was influencing business practices, community attitudes, and her own understanding of how individual experiences connected to systemic patterns of discrimination. "I received a call from the mayor's office today," James mentioned casually, cutting into his perfectly prepared salmon. "They're interested in developing a city-wide initiative to address discrimination in public accommodations, using your experience as a case study for why such policies matter. They'd like to meet with both of us to discuss how to move forward." Isabella paused with her fork halfway to her mouth, struck by how her quiet pursuit of nursing excellence had suddenly positioned her as a potential advocate for broader social change. The prospect was both exciting and daunting, suggesting opportunities to influence policy decisions, while also requiring her to step into public roles she had never sought or imagined. "What would that involve?" she asked, recognizing that her answer would determine not just her own future, but potentially the experiences of countless other people who faced similar discrimination throughout the city. James smiled, understanding the weight of the decision she was contemplating. "Whatever you're comfortable with," he assured her. "But imagine if Portland became the first city to implement comprehensive policies, ensuring that all residents have equal access to public accommodations, regardless of their appearance, occupation, or perceived economic status. Your experience could be the foundation for changes that protect thousands of other people." As they shared dessert and reflected on the evening's conversations, Isabella realized that her father's wisdom about judging character through how people treated those who couldn't advance their interests had guided her to this moment. James had proven his character not through grand gestures, but through consistent respect and genuine concern for justice that extended beyond their personal relationship. The meal concluded with Trevor presenting Isabella with a framed certificate, designating her as Meridian's ambassador for inclusive hospitality, a largely symbolic gesture that nonetheless represented the restaurant's commitment to learning from their mistakes and building a more welcoming environment for all customers. As they prepared to leave, Isabella noticed that several other diners approached to express support for the changes her story had inspired, with one couple mentioning that they had chosen Meridian specifically because they had heard about the restaurant's renewed commitment to treating all customers with dignity and respect. Outside the restaurant, as James's driver waited patiently, beside the Bentley, Isabella found herself thinking about the choice she faced regarding the mayor's invitation. The decision would determine whether she remained a private individual who had experienced a moment of public attention or became an advocate for systemic changes that could affect countless other people's daily experiences. "James," she said, looking up at the man who had transformed from patient to friend to potential partner in social advocacy, "I think I'm ready to take this beyond just my personal experience. If we can create policies that prevent other people from facing the discrimination I experienced, then maybe all of this attention will have been worthwhile." James's face broke into a genuine smile that reflected both pride in her decision and excitement about the possibilities it represented. "I think your father would be very proud," he said simply, "and I'm honored to support whatever role you choose to play in making our community more just and inclusive." 6 months later, Portland became the first major city to implement comprehensive anti-discrimination policies for public accommodations, with enforcement mechanisms and training requirements that had been developed based on Isabella's experience and James's business expertise. The Martinez Standards, as they became known, were adopted by 12 other cities within the first year, creating a ripple effect of policy changes that protected workers, students, and residents from the kind of casual discrimination that Isabella had experienced. Isabella continued her nursing career at Riverside Memorial Hospital, but also began speaking at conferences and policy forums about dignity, respect, and the importance of creating inclusive communities. James redirected significant portions of his development projects toward affordable housing and community resources, discovering that profitable business could also contribute to social justice when guided by genuine concern for human welfare. There, friendship deepened into something approaching family, bound together not by romance, but by shared commitment to values that transcended differences in background, wealth, or social status. They had learned that meaningful change often began with individual recognition of injustice and the courage to respond with both compassion and concrete action. Most importantly, they had discovered that true worth couldn't be measured by external markers like clothing, occupation, or bank account balances, but by how people treated others when they had nothing to gain from kindness except the satisfaction of doing what was right. Isabella still carried her father's photograph in her uniform pocket, but now it was accompanied by a new understanding that his wisdom about character and dignity had prepared her not just for nursing, but for advocacy that honored his memory while building a more just community for everyone. Sometimes the most profound changes begin with the simplest recognition that every person deserves to be seen, valued, and treated with dignity, regardless of their circumstances. In Isabella's case, that recognition had come from an unexpected friendship that proved powerful enough to transform not just two lives, but an entire city's approach to justice and inclusion. If this story touched your heart and reminded you of the invisible heroes in your own community, we'd love to hear about them in the comments below. Who in your life provides quiet service without recognition? How can we better support the essential? Workers, caregivers, and everyday people who keep our communities functioning with dignity and compassion. Please take a moment to like this video if you believe in the power of standing up for what's right, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us how individual courage and genuine human connection can create ripple effects of positive change that extend far beyond what we might ever imagine possible. Because sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply recognizing the worth and dignity that exists in every person we encounter, and having the courage to act on that. Recognition when it matters most.